So we are going to go ahead and get started, and people can join us as we go. So my name is the Reverend Jenny Martin Caughman, and I live in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. I'm an ordained Swedenborgian minister, was ordained back in 2012. Am currently serving a United Methodist church. There are no Swedenborgian churches in Tennessee, so I am gifted to be able to serve in that capacity. There is one Swedenborgian member of our congregation, and several years ago, after one of my sermons, she said, "Oh, Jenny, your sermons are so Swedenborgian." And I had to laugh because, you know, it's a Methodist church. I never mention Swedenborg. I don't talk about correspondences, but it's how I see God. It's how I see the world. It's how I see people. It's how I see life. So it's just the essence of who I am, a Swedenborgian. And so that's just how it comes out. For me, theology in practice is what speaks to me the most. You know, how are we called to live and all of that? So when we come to why am I offering this class, this mini course, I am a huge fan of Desmond Tutu and his goodness, his joy, his way of presenting complicated, challenging, significant topics in such a very accessible way. Not the way Swedenborg always does things, you know, not nearly so accessible. But Desmond Tutu is able to distill what really matters. So what I'm going to do is, you know, be primarily using a PowerPoint. So I am going to move to sharing my screen, and hopefully this will work. Oh, yeah, I have to press share. Ah, life is good, pretty good. There we are. So everybody should have that they can see. So as I said, what was important to me is Desmond Tutu, and he wrote a wonderful book called Made for Goodness. And the basic premise of that book is that we are loved simply because we are. Not because of what we do, but simply because of who we are. So I was struck by the power of and the beauty of that. And so I did a book study at my church here in Tennessee on this book, Made for Goodness. And then that turned into this mini course, the foundation for it. This course, as described in the messenger, will be broken down into 4 areas with the overall goal of being exploring what we can do as individuals as well as a community to cultivate intentionally a perspective of love and kindness, how we can be open to heaven while living here on earth. So we will move toward this goal by exploring, first of all, oh, sorry, I'm already confused a little bit. So Tutu says that we were made for goodness, and this is the central part of our essence. And this very much, in my mind, goes with Swedenborg's teaching that the Lord's divine providence has as its goal a heaven from the human race. And so this is the foundation, this is our goodness. So that is going to be the first focus of the talk. Secondly, I will move into truth and understanding. How truth and understanding help us to recognize that which in ourselves and in our world serve to either separate us from God, separate us from goodness and truth, or to connect us and align us with God. The third area of focus will be what can we actively do to enhance our response to God's call toward goodness and thus grow into our home in heaven. So the question is, how can we work in harmony with divine providence? And lastly, assuming and hoping that we have time, we will look at the role of creativity and the arts in this process. I typically like to present in a very informal way. And so, in an ideal world, this mini course would include a lot of interactive discussion. But Zoom makes that difficult, and especially with the number of people that we have here. I can't possibly see and respond to all the hands being waved. So as much as I'd like to, there's probably not going to be a lot of discussion here. That being said, I love talking about this stuff. So if you have any questions or thoughts, you can email me, you can call me, jot them down. I don't know, we could even create another Zoom at another time to talk about this in more depth if people wanted to. But would really love to hear your thoughts, responses, and ideas. Um, so as I said, the seeds for this mini course are found in a book that was written by Archbishop Desmond Tutu and his daughter Empo. As most of you probably know, Desmond Tutu received the Nobel Peace Prize back in 1984 for his work to bring about the end of apartheid in South Africa. As an Anglican priest and eventually archbishop, he worked tirelessly toward this goal. When apartheid was over, he became chair of South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which many people see as the reason why South Africa was able to move forward after the years of just atrocious things that happened there. During the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, victims and their families met face to face with the perpetrators of these atrocities, and they heard, often in harrowing detail, just what had happened to their loved ones. In response to the perpetrators' willingness to be honest, they were not charged for the crimes that were committed. And Desmond Tutu describes how they witnessed many remarkable instances of forgiveness. And that led to another book of his on forgiveness, which I would also highly recommend. For me, someone who has experienced and witnessed so many examples of these horrible things, what we can do to one another, and still finds his life on the belief that we were made for goodness, that just carries a huge amount of weight. This is not a Pollyanna person. This is somebody who's been to hell and back and yet still believes in the power of goodness. And as I said, his daughter, Empo, also co-wrote this book with him. She was an Anglican priest also in South Africa until she came out as being lesbian, and then they unfortunately stripped her of her titles. But again, she did co-write this book with her. In the preface of the book, he says that many people asked him, "Why are you so happy? What do you see that the others of us are missing?" And he said that the book made forgiveness and why this makes all the difference is his answer to those questions. So the book is based on three very important truths. So why is he so happy? First of all, because we will see that we were all designed for goodness. And when we recognize that truth, it makes all the difference in the world. His second truth is that we are perfectly loved with a love that requires nothing of us. So we can stop being good and simply choose to live into the goodness that is our essence. And then the third is that God holds out an invitation to us, an invitation to turn away from the anxious striving and to turn towards wholeness that leads to the flourishing of life. So we can't help but ask, if we were made for goodness, why do we experience badness and evil in the world? And Tutu explains, we also know that God has given us the gift of freedom, and that in order for freedom to be real, we must be free to choose right and equally free to choose wrong. And again, that's not a concept that is unfamiliar to Swedenborgians. This is very compatible to what Swedenborg teaches, as well as the Bible, that we were made in the image and likeness of God. And then, as I've already mentioned, Swedenborg teaches us that the Lord's divine providence has as its goal a heaven from the human race. So in Divine Providence, Swedenborg addresses the problem of evil, how we can reconcile God's goodness and power with the reality of the presence of evil in the Swedenborg in the world. Desmond Tutu also tackles this topic, and he asks and answers in the book such questions as, where is God when we suffer? Where is God when we fail? Why does God let us sin? And when we do suffer, fail, or sin, how do we find our way home to goodness? How can we rediscover our essence? His answer, like so much of what Swedenborg says, is both very simple and yet also tremendously profound. He says that when we are able to hear God's voice and to see with God's eyes, we will be able to see the world as it truly is. So again, the foundational premise of the book is that we are fundamentally good. And Desmond Tutu says, when you come to think of it, that's who we are at our core. And then he asks, why else do we get so outraged by wrong? So when we see something wrong in the world, we respond, we get mad. And he says that's a sign that we are fundamentally good. He also says you can see from the people we truly admire that we are attracted to goodness. We do not revere people who are successful. We might envy them, and I think that's important to acknowledge, and perhaps wish that their money were transferred into our bank account. But the people we revere are not successful. They are something else. They are good. So his point is that we recognize and are attracted to goodness because we were made to recognize and to appreciate it. That in us which values goodness, recognize and responds to that in the outside world, that in other people, which is also good. So how might we understand this from a Swedenborgian lens? And I would say externals and internals and their interplay. Our most internal part is our soul, that part of us which is open to heaven. And when that internal part sees the essence of God in the outside world, some example or expression of goodness and or truth, it recognizes it. You know, I think that's one of the beauties and values of correspondence. Why do we respond to beauty in the outside world? So Desmond Tutu sees this valuing of that which is good from a theological perspective. And he says that we are hungry for God, but we don't always know that it is God that we crave. So this lack of recognition can lead us astray, which what Swedenborgians, I think we can certainly understand. You know, we follow our loves. And when our loves are incorrectly prioritized, when love of self rather than love of neighbor is more important, or when we have a greater commitment to externals and worldly goals rather than internals and spiritual goals, then we run into trouble. That could be a whole nother mini course on its own. So I know that could be really explored, but we're just going to leave it at that. So Desmond Tutu believes that because we are fundamentally good, evil will not have the last word. And so that serves as a great piece of hope and optimism for him. And when we read Swedenborg, you know, his optimism may not be quite so obvious. But if you think about it, Divine Providence is an extremely optimistic book. If we trust God, then we can believe that God's plan for a heaven from the human race will in fact be realized. And if what we want in this life is so central to our experience in the afterlife, that also is a vote for the reality and presence of goodness and of truth. So I can't, of course, summarize the entire book. There were so many meaningful and relevant parts to it. But I cannot overemphasize the power of the experience of reading such books like this. Because when you do, you are truly steeped in goodness. And it really felt to me like reading this kind of put me in the presence of the heavens. So I would encourage all of you to read it. So in summary, why does it matter that we were made for goodness? Tutu explains that when we recognize our fundamental goodness, we act differently and we feel different. We are happier, we are healthier. And I love this. He says, God is pretty smart. It feels good to be good, and we know it. So when we attend to our deepest yearnings, our very nature, our life changes forever. And person by person, so does the world. So again, that's why it matters. And it's such a beautiful and hopeful message. So the goal of this course is to foster a perspective of love. And I firmly believe that we can try to choose this perspective. We can choose to be with the angels. But in order to be successful and to do in this choosing, I think we also need to tackle what gets in the way. And this takes us to the second part of this talk, which is how truth and understanding can help us recognize that which in ourselves and the world works to either separate us from or connect us to God. Swedenborg teaches, and this is going to be very fundamental and probably something that you all know, that as we were made in the image and likeness of God. So because of that, there are two aspects of our being which are crucial to us being human. And these, of course, are our will and our understanding. Our will is that aspect of us which loves. As to the source of it's the source of our intentions, and it's our will which motivates our thoughts and our actions. On the other side, our rationality is based in our understanding and our ability to recognize truth and to learn about God, ourselves, and then the significance of our faith. So while we human beings love to think of ourselves as primarily rational, as we know, Swedenborg teaches that what we truly love colors how we see everything. And thus it is our will which leads our understanding and not the other way around. That being said, he also teaches that our understanding can be lifted up to the highest heaven. So we, of course, experience this as we know what can be good and true, but that doesn't mean we always choose to do or to say that which is good or true. We can know what is good and true before we actually love what is good and true. And so there's, again, this relationship between our will and our understanding is a complicated one. They both influence each other, and at different times, one takes precedence over the other. That too could be a mini course in itself. So we're just going to have to gently put that aside, but just leave that fundamental piece. So for the purpose of this course, we are now asking, if we were made for goodness, why don't we always think and behave that way? What is it that separates us from God? If we crave connection with God, with our souls and our inner spiritual selves, why do we get distracted by externals and worldly concerns? And if divine providence has as its goal a heaven from the human race, why do we think and do things which are more aligned with the hells? Well, the answer to that is freedom. Freedom. It's what Desmond Tutu talked about. It's what Swedenborg talks about. They both say that we have been given freedom. And for that freedom to be true and to be real, we have the ability to choose either goodness or evil, truth or falsity, love of neighbor or unrestrained love of self, or something in the middle. So again, the critical question is, Why do we use freedom in hurtful ways? To hurt ourselves and to hurt people that we truly care about, as well as people that we don't, necessarily care about. Um, and the answer to this, to answer this, we must seek the truth about ourselves as individuals and as a society. And we must truthfully recognize our actual intentions and our motivations. And most of us struggle to do that. Sometimes in some situations more than others, some of us more than others. But I don't know that any of us can do that all the time. So, when it comes to regeneration, Swedenborg is abundantly clear and simple about what needs to be done. He says it's very, very simple. What? Repentance, reformation, regeneration, right? He teaches all we need to do is we must just simply turn away from evils simply because they are evil and choose good, right? He says active repentance is examining ourselves, recognizing and admitting our sins, praying to the Lord, and beginning a new life, right? Sounds good? Have you guys ever heard that before? Probably, right? But even when you know that and you believe it, how many of us do this fully and completely? Right? It's something that even though we know it, we struggle to do it in our lives. So while Swedenborg, in my not so humble opinion, brilliantly describes the inner workings of our hearts and our minds, he doesn't write a whole lot about what enables us to take these steps. What enables us to not deny and hide, but instead to recognize and admit our sins. I love the ending of Lois Dole's May Messenger article, where she was summarizing the life of Chauncey Giles. And in that, she writes, the chapter ends with Chauncey again making a plea for the messenger to become more relevant to the life of its reader, especially in view of this terrible crisis. And the terrible crisis that they're referring to was the Civil War. He said, I have no belief in the method of teaching truth that begins and ends with generalities, that we must shun evils and do good. What evils shall we shun? And what good shall we do? And that's really the Christian question, isn't it? What does it look like to love our neighbor? Because we don't always agree on that. And if we're going to add a Swedenborgian perspective, what is truth? What is goodness? What is evil? What is falsity? So while it is crucial to know that yes, what we love influences what we see as both good and true. How do we work with that truth? The question is, how can we recognize our own biases? Because we all have them. We all have them, and they get in the way and affect what we see as good and true. So remember that Swedenborg teaches that first we learn and come to understand that which is good and true. And then we gradually grow to love and thus embody and embrace that which is good and true, not out of fear, not out of the desire to look good, but because we come to love that which is good and true. And this is truly the essence of regeneration. So, to understand what separates us from God, to acknowledge when we shun that which is good and true instead of embracing them, what this requires is introspection and self awareness and honesty. And the critical piece here is for the goal of this introspection to not be to bolster our own self esteem, not to make us look good, but instead to be the quest for actual truth. So, again, what can help us move in this direction? How can we truly desire truth? Well, I think there are two important things that can help us. The first being understanding. If we are taught that truth and goodness are the source of lasting happiness, as we are taught in our faith tradition that they are the foundations of heaven, This can motivate us to seek them. The other piece that firmly I believe matters is knowing that we are loved, regardless of what we think or do. This can help us to dare to be honest with ourselves and with each other. Knowing that we are loved can help to lower our defenses. Sorry. Okay, so we were talking about if you are with somebody, your boss, an acquaintance, who is constantly criticizing you, putting you down, making you look bad, going out of his way to make you feel bad. Is it wise or smart to willingly give that person ammunition? Most of us, when we are dealing with such a person, are inclined to hide our mistakes and our faults. So when they angrily ask us, what happened here? We're going to sit very quietly, say, I don't know, just not say anything. And just to let that go. However, think of how different it is if you are with somebody that you trust completely and fully, that knows you inside and out. They know your quirks, they know your positive traits as well as your faults, and yet they still love you, right? When they ask, what happened here? We're much more likely to be honest and share with them what we did and why we did it. Um, so that gives you an example of how being loved can help us be more honest and open. Okay. So the point is when we do not feel good about ourselves, we cover ourselves up and we often lie and that just continues to make us not feel good about ourselves. We just feel worse and worse. So knowing we are loved simply because we are, not because of what we do, can help us to get the courage to be more honest. So knowing this, what is our job? How can we work with this? So a big piece of this is self-awareness. And self-awareness can help us to be kinder and to choose the path of goodness and truth. So self-awareness. By knowing what our issues are, we are better able to recognize what triggers us. So we can begin to answer questions such as, when do we act defensively? What leads us to blame others for a conflict or a problem instead of exploring how we are responsible? What are we afraid of? It can help us identify what we fear or dread. If we can do that, can lead to a greater understanding of our true intentions. What feelings or circumstances might we be avoiding at any cost? To answer questions such as, what types of people do I or we have very little tolerance for? And what is the root for that intolerance? And lastly, who is God? Is God a being who loves us? Or is God somebody in our minds who is angry and punitive? Because depending on what our image of God is, it's gonna either be wise or foolish to trust God. And we need to know where this view comes from. Self-awareness can also be applied in the other direction. So it can help us to know what helps us to be open and therefore want to be kind to others. What can help me to make space in my heart for others and thus hear and recognize and respond to their perspective or their needs? What enables me to stay in a place of discomfort and to temporarily put my fear, needs, or desires aside in pursuit of a higher good? What helps me to turn inwardly and to turn toward God, that which is the source of all that is good and all that is true? And what enables me to cooperate with rather than thwart divine providence, to wisely, lovingly navigate the rapids in the stream of divine providence? Well, answering these questions is really the root or the essence of the third part of this talk, which is what can we do to enhance our inclination to hear and respond to God's call, which is to open up our interiors. How can we intentionally foster a perspective of love? And what can we do that will help us to grow into our home in heaven? Now, the answers to these questions are ultimately very personal, and we each need to do the work ourselves. But I think there are some helpful generalities. So I believe that the perspectives such as that presented in Desmond Tutu's book, Made Forgiveness, believing that we are loved as we are, can really help. Because if we are loved and accepted fully as we are, we don't need to pretend to be other than we are, to be valued and accepted. We don't need to act defensively. To see as God sees ourselves and others can lead to a greater degree of kindness, acceptance, and compassion, both for ourselves and for other people. So, in regards to what we can do to foster this perspective of love, a second thing that we can do is surround ourselves with people and things, experiences that help us both to be less defensive and more open to challenging truths and feelings. Who are our angels on this earth that bring out the good in us? Again, remember that example of the critical boss. Who are we with? There's a wonderful artistic term or theory that the observation that how a color is seen, perceived, or experienced changes depending on what the colors are around it. So think of a rich red. If it's surrounded by a lot of light, bright colors, it can seem very dark and strong. If it's surrounded by very dark colors, it can seem very bright. And we human beings are the same. Swedenborg teaches that our understanding can be lifted to a higher spiritual state. And our teachings matter because they inform and impact our choices, what we are striving for. So, for example, if we read Heaven and Hell, by reading about the higher heavens, what the angels there are like, what matters to them, we are shown a goal. We are shown attitudes and actions that we can try and emulate. It teaches us what we can be striving for. Similarly, when we read about the hells, we learn about thoughts and behaviors that we should avoid. Remember, shunning them because they are evils. So we're given examples and information about what are good and what is evil, what is true and what is false. And this information can help counteract the materialistic, self-centered messages that our culture so often puts forward. And this helps us to make more informed choices in our day-to-day lives. Now, remember that Swedenborg teaches that true love does not compel. As we've said, we have freedom. So we must choose. So we need to ask ourselves, what helps us to choose wisely? So from a Swedenborgian perspective, the spiritual, we need to choose. How do we choose the spiritual over the physical? Interiors over exteriors, love of God and neighbor over primarily love of self. So we also need to ask ourselves, what can we do to help our wills to grow more loving? In French, there are two words to know, savoir and connaître. Savoir is an intellectual knowing, like I know how to read, while connaître is a more personal, oh, I know that person. So when we read, there are important differences that in English we don't always, I think, appreciate. So when we read about the reality of the spiritual, that God loves us, but that alone, I don't think can transform our hearts. What is much more powerful is to experience the reality of the spiritual, the reality of the love of God. This is what Desmond Tutu refers to as hearing God's voice. There are many ways that we can do this, but certainly prayer and worship are something. Desmond Tutu talks about the importance of praying in a more receptive mode, not us just talking to God, but listening to and for God. He spends a lot of time in prayer, sometimes to the frustration of the people that he works with, because he won't, come to something if he's on retreat, and people can get frustrated with that. So remember these two parts of our self-awareness, that which makes it hard for us to be kind, loving, and open to each other, as well as what facilitates that. So we each need to know, what is it that feeds our soul? And that is a very personal thing that each one of us needs to answer for ourselves. Desmond Tutu spends 2 chapters talking about hearing God's voice, which can lead us to seeing with God's eyes. And he says this alters how we see ourselves, others, and the world. So this will bring us very quickly to our last little topic, which is the role of creativity and the arts. Because in my life, they have been so crucial in helping me understand and experience and express myself. So I think I came up with 3 things in the ways that the creativity and the arts can really help us. The first is, beauty is a form of goodness. As such, when we see, hear, and experience beauty, it can serve to connect us to that within ourselves, which is good and true. I truly believe that beauty nourishes our souls. So this, can be seen as an example of correspondences. Remember, we heard that beautiful talk earlier, but that everything in the physical world corresponds to something in the spiritual world. So when we see something beautiful in the external world, it speaks to our souls, and it serves to connect the external and the internal. And it feeds the internal as we have an external experience of an internal truth. Another example, reason why creativity is so important, is self-expression. We were made in the image and likeness of God. And as such, God, who is our creator, we are also called to be creator. And so self-expression can be seen as a form of soul expression. How do we allow our souls to speak to ourselves and to the world? How can they be seen? How can they be heard? And my sense is, when we allow that to happen and when we experience somebody else's soul being expressed, it provides a deep sense of satisfaction. Um, so that can be very important. This self-expression and witnessing the arts taps into our inner self, our soul. And I think that happens whether we understand it or not. The beauty and the power of the arts and creativity is they can bypass our understanding. So the third way that I think that creativity and the arts are important in all of this is they provide another form of truth. For whatever reason, and I don't fully know this, through the arts, we seem to have a greater tolerance for truth. I mean, if you think about it, that's why satire is so beautiful. But in poetry, in theater, in fiction, in visual arts, in music, it just seems like we can tolerate it much more. I worked for years as a music therapist working with terminally ill cancer patients. And many times people didn't want to talk about the fact that they were dying or any issues that were left with that. But when you ask them, well, what song do you want to hear? They would pick a song which described exactly how they were feeling. So again, it provided not only self-expression, but it enabled the truth to be out there in a way that was tolerable, while directly talking about it would not be tolerable. So why this is, I don't know. I don't know if it's the gift of the symbolic. You know, if that's the gift of correspondences. But it seems like often through creative means, our defenses are down and it seems to bypass our censor. And so we get to be more truthful and more honest. So we just have 3 or 4 minutes. I would just like to finish by reading a last little bit from a quote from Desmond Tutu's book. And Desmond Tutu and his daughter write, "Because God always dwells in us, in all of us, there is always hope. There is always hope that the scales will fall from our eyes and we will see as God sees. Prayer makes the scales fall off fast. We are not originally sinners distant from God. We are originally the crowning achievement of creation. We are those created in the image and likeness of God. We are created out of the abundance of God's love. We are created for God's joy. With God's eyes, we see our enemies as they are, a bundle of incomprehensible hurts and hatreds, anger sheathed in human form. And we see them as they truly are, people made in God's own image with hopes, loves, laughter, blood, and tears like ours. With God's eyes, we see our children as they are, a pimply jumble of faults and failings, forgotten homework and skipped chores. And we see them as they truly are, gifts to us of grace and wonder, treasurers of divine imagination, teachers who point us to God. With God's eyes, we can see ourselves as we are, with all of our pride, every lack, all our limitations, and each prejudice. And we can see ourselves as we truly are, not sinners in need of saving, but saints in need of seeing. And all of us are good. No, not just good, but very good. We are precious to God, the crown of creation, beautiful beyond compare. Very, very good. Thank you all to Alex and Emily for helping out with that. It is 4:20, so I think out of respect for our next presenters, they need 10 minutes to get going. So I am going to sign off, but just want to thank you all for your presence and support, and blessings.